The rain in Cleveland, Ohio, felt like it had a grudge against the world that morning, and Michael Sawyer stood beneath the glass awning of Holbrook Tower with a soaked résumé clutched to his chest, watching the last of his hope drip off the edge of the building along with the rainwater. He had just been told, in a voice so polished it barely sounded human, that he was not the right fit. He had heard those words 14 times in 4 months. But this time, as he turned to walk away into the gray Cleveland morning, something inside him quietly broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, final crack, like the sound of a man's spine bending under a weight it was never built to carry. He did not know that 11 floors above him, a man in a $3,000 suit was about to sprint through a marble lobby, past his own stunned assistant, out into the pouring rain, just to catch him before he disappeared into the crowd forever. If you believe people deserve second chances, if you believe that behind every no there might be a not yet, then before you go any further, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel, because stories like Michael's are exactly why we're here. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Michael Sawyer was 34 years old, and if you had met him 3 years earlier, you would have seen a different man entirely. Back then, he had been a project coordinator at a mid-sized construction firm in Akron, the kind of job that wasn't glamorous but paid the mortgage and put gas in the truck and let him take his daughter, Grace, to the county fair every August without checking his bank balance first. He had a wife then, too. Her name was Rachel, and she had a laugh that filled up a room the way sunlight fills a kitchen in the early morning, warm and unhurried and impossible to ignore. They had been high school sweethearts in a small town outside Canton, the kind of love story people used to write letters about, and when Grace was born, Michael used to joke that his daughter had inherited her mother's stubbornness and his own bad sense of direction, because the girl could get lost walking from the living room to the kitchen but she would never, ever admit she was wrong about anything. Then, on a Tuesday in March, 3 years before the morning Michael stood in the rain outside Holbrook Tower, Rachel went in for what the doctors called a routine scan after months of unexplained fatigue, and the world Michael had built his entire identity around collapsed in the space of a single sentence. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. Rachel fought harder than anyone Michael had ever known, harder than he thought a human body was capable of fighting, but 6 months became 4, and 4 became a hospice bed in the corner of their living room so that Grace, who was 5 years old at the time, could fall as 30 asleep some nights holding her mother's hand. Rachel died on a Sunday morning in October, with the autumn light coming gold and soft through the curtains, and Michael held Grace on his lap in the doorway because she was too young to understand why the room had gone so quiet, and he remembers thinking, in the strange numb clarity that grief sometimes gives you, that he had exactly one job left in his life, and that job was to make sure his daughter never doubted, not for a single day, that she was loved enough for 2 parents. The problem was that grief, as it turns out, does not care about mortgages or performance reviews. Michael missed work. Not because he wanted to, not because he was lazy or careless, but because some mornings he simply could not make his body move, could not make himself put on a tie and pretend that the world had not just ended. His employer was patient for a while, and then patience ran out the way it always does in places where profit matters more than people, and 6 months after Rachel's funeral, Michael was let go in a restructuring that somehow only seemed to restructure him. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he would find something else within a few weeks. He did not yet know that grief has a way of following a man into every job interview, sitting in the chair beside him, answering questions in a voice just quiet enough that only he can hear it, reminding him that he used to be someone whole. 3 years passed, and Michael's savings thinned into nothing, and then the nothing became debt, and the debt became the kind of quiet, grinding fear that lives behind a man's eyes even when he is smiling for his daughter's sake. He and Grace moved twice, each apartment smaller and further from the good school district than the last, until they landed in a one-bedroom on the east side of Cleveland where Michael slept on a pull-out couch so that Grace, who was now 8 years old with her mother's exact laugh, could have the only bedroom to herself. He worked when he could find work, warehouse shifts, a stretch driving for a delivery service until his old truck's transmission gave out, weekend landscaping jobs that left his hands raw and his back aching, but none of it was steady, none of it was enough, and every single job application he submitted for something better, something with health insurance and a future, came back the same way. Overqualified. Underqualified. Gap in employment. Not the right fit. That morning at Holbrook Tower had felt different, at first. The company was called Hartwell Logistics, a shipping and supply chain firm that had grown from a regional trucking outfit into one of the largest logistics companies in the Midwest, and the position was for an operations coordinator, work that Michael had done before, work he was good at, work that would have meant health insurance for Grace and a real bedroom instead of a converted storage closet, and maybe, just maybe, a life that felt like it belonged to him again instead of one he was merely surviving. He had pressed his one good shirt with a borrowed iron from the woman next door. He had rehearsed his answers in the bathroom mirror while Grace ate cereal at the kitchen counter and told him he looked like a real business guy, Daddy, which had made him laugh for the first time in what felt like weeks. He had walked into that building with something dangerously close to hope, and hope, Michael had learned the hard way, was the most expensive thing a poor man could afford to carry. The interview itself had gone reasonably well, or so Michael thought, right up until the final 10 minutes, when the hiring manager, a clipped, efficient woman named Patricia Doyle, had asked him to explain the 3-year gap in his employment history. Michael had answered honestly, because he did not know how to do otherwise. He explained that his wife had passed away, that he had been his daughter's sole caregiver, that the gap represented not laziness but the hardest and most important work of his life. He watched Patricia's expression shift as he spoke, watched the polite, professional mask settle back into place, and he knew, the way you know a storm is coming from the particular color of the sky, that the answer had cost him the job. Companies did not want complicated stories. They wanted clean resumes and confident men who had never needed to hold their dying wife's hand or explain to an 8-year-old why mommy wasn't coming home. 15 minutes later, Patricia walked into the elevator with a handshake that felt like a door closing, and told him, in that same polished voice, that they would be in touch, which both of them understood to be a lie of politeness, the kind adults tell each other so no one has to watch anyone else's heart actually break. Michael did not cry in the elevator. He had gotten good, over 3 years, at not crying in elevators, in parking lots, in the frozen food aisle of the grocery store when he could not afford the good ice cream Grace liked and had to put it back on the shelf while she pretended not to notice. He walked out through the enormous marble lobby of Holbrook Tower, past the fountain that probably cost more than his entire annual income, out through the revolving doors and into a rainstorm that had apparently been waiting for him, and he stood there under the awning for one long moment, because he did not, in that instant, know where a man was supposed to go when he had run out of places to be hopeful. What Michael did not know, could not have known, was that on the 11th floor of Holbrook Tower, in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray sprawl of the city, a man named Nathaniel Cole, the founder and CEO of Hartwell Logistics, had just finished reviewing that afternoon's interview notes on his tablet, notes forwarded automatically from HR as a matter of routine, and had stopped cold on a single line in Patricia Doyle's summary of Michael Sawyer's interview. The line read, "Candidate cited 3-year employment gap due to spouse's death and sole custody of young child. Strong technical answers but gap presents risk. Recommend pass." Nathaniel Cole was 51 years old, and very few people at Hartwell Logistics knew the full story of how he had built the company from 3 second-hand delivery trucks and a folding table in his garage into a business worth hundreds of millions of dollars, because Nathaniel did not talk about it, not out of shame, but because the memory still sat in his chest like a stone he had never quite learned to put down. 22 years earlier, Nathaniel had been a young father himself, married to a woman named Diane, raising a son named Jonathan, working 80-hour weeks trying to keep his fledgling trucking business from collapsing under its own debt. And in the middle of that grinding, desperate stretch of years, Diane had been diagnosed with early-onset multiple sclerosis, and Nathaniel had spent 2 years trying to run a failing business and care for a sick wife and raise a 4-year-old son, and he had failed at all three, not because he did not try hard enough, but because no single human being can carry that much weight alone. The business nearly collapsed. He missed important moments with his son that he would never get back. And when he finally did stabilize, when Hartwell Logistics finally began to grow into something real, it was too late to undo the years he had lost, too late to get back the version of himself who had once believed a man could do everything at once and do it well. So when Nathaniel Cole read that single line about a father who had lost his wife and raised his daughter alone, and who had been rejected not for lack of skill but for the unforgivable sin of having survived something hard, something old and painful shifted in his chest, something that felt less like sympathy and more like recognition, like looking into a mirror 22 years in the past. He asked his assistant, a sharp young woman named Deborah, what time the candidate had left the building. Deborah checked the visitor log and told him it had been less than 10 minutes. Nathaniel did not stop to think about how strange it would look for the CEO of a $300 million company to go sprinting through his own lobby without an umbrella. He simply stood up, said something Deborah would later describe as not quite a sentence, more like a decision, and walked out of his office so fast that his suit jacket caught on the edge of the door. Michael was 3 blocks away by the time Nathaniel burst through the revolving doors of Holbrook Tower and into the rain, his dress shoes immediately soaked through, his silver hair plastered flat against his forehead within seconds. He had no umbrella, no plan beyond the single burning conviction that he could not let this particular man disappear into the crowd the way so many other things in Nathaniel's life had disappeared before he could hold on to them. He half walked, half ran down the sidewalk, scanning the scattered pedestrians hurrying past with their own umbrellas and their own hidden griefs, and it was only when he reached the corner of 9th and Superior that he spotted him, a tall man in a soaked gray shirt, no jacket, walking with his shoulders curled forward the particular way that Nathaniel recognized instantly, because it was the exact way he himself had walked through the parking lot of St. Vincent's Hospital the day the doctors first told him Diane's diagnosis was permanent. It was the walk of a man trying to hold himself together with nothing but willpower and the fear of what would happen to the people who depended on him if he let go. "Mr. Sawyer!" Nathaniel called out, his voice cracking against the noise of the rain and the traffic, and when Michael did not turn, because why would a stranger in the rain expect anyone to be calling his name, Nathaniel called again, louder, closing the distance between them at a jog that made his lungs burn in a way they had not in years. "Michael! Please wait!" Michael turned, confused, half certain the man chasing him through the rain must be mistaken, must be calling for someone else, and when he recognized the silver-haired man in the now ruined suit as the same man whose photograph hung in the lobby of Holbrook Tower beneath the words founder and CEO, his first instinct, born of 3 years of disappointment, was to brace for one more piece of bad news, one more professional humiliation to add to the pile. He stood very still on the sidewalk, rain running down his face, and waited. Nathaniel stopped in front of him, breathing hard, and for a moment neither man said anything, because Nathaniel had run 3 blocks in dress shoes without actually planning what he would say once he caught up, and Michael was too stunned and too exhausted to fill the silence. Finally, Nathaniel spoke, and his voice had none of the smooth, practiced quality Michael associated with executives. It was rough, almost raw, a man speaking from somewhere underneath his own carefully built life. "I read your interview notes," he said. "The gap. Your wife. Your daughter." He paused, wiping rain from his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry. Not for what happened to you, I mean, I am sorry for that too, more than you know, but I'm sorry for what happened in that room today. It was wrong. And I don't let my company make decisions like that, not when I'm the one who's supposed to be building it." Michael did not know what to say. 3 years of rejection had taught him that hope was a luxury he could not afford, and yet here was a man, the founder of the company that had just turned him away, standing in the rain, having chased him down the street, telling him that a decision had been wrong. "I don't understand," Michael finally managed, his voice thinner than he wanted it to be. "You're the CEO. Why would you?" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, because the question underneath the question was simply, why would anyone chase after me? And 3 years of being told no had made that the hardest question in the world to ask out loud. Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, rain dripping from both their faces, the city moving in a blur around them as though the two of them were standing inside a small, private storm that belonged only to this conversation. Because 22 years ago, he said quietly, I was you. Not exactly, every story is different, but I know what it is to watch the person you love disappear a little more every day, and to have to keep showing up for a child who needs you to be strong even when you have nothing left. I know what it is to fail at things because you're carrying something no resume has a box for. I built this whole company, this whole life, and there are still nights I lie awake wondering if it was worth what it cost me. And today I read a piece of paper that reduced everything you've survived down to a single word: risk, and something in me could not let that be the end of your story. Not without at least trying to make it right. Michael felt something crack open in his chest, not the same quiet, final crack from the elevator, but a different kind entirely, the crack of a door that had been sealed shut for 3 years finally admitting a sliver of light. He did not cry, not yet, not there on the sidewalk, but his eyes burned and his throat closed, and all he could manage was a small, disbelieving shake of his head. I have a daughter, he said, as though that explained everything, because to him, it did. Grace. She's 8. It's just us. His voice broke slightly. I need this to be real. I can't afford for this to be some kind of mistake. It's real, Nathaniel said. Come back inside. Let's talk. Not an interview, a conversation. I want to hear about Grace. I want to hear about your wife, if you're willing to tell me. And then I want to talk about a job, because I think Hartwell Logistics has been missing exactly the kind of person who knows what it means to keep showing up when everything in you wants to quit. If this story is already touching something in you, imagine how it felt for Michael, standing there in the rain, hearing the first real kindness he'd been offered in years. Take a moment right now to like this video and leave a comment with a single word that describes how you're feeling, because the story is only just beginning, and where it goes next might be the most important part. They walked back to Holbrook Tower together, soaked to the skin, and the lobby staff who had watched Nathaniel sprint out into the rain 20 minutes earlier now watched him walk back in beside the very man he had turned down, and something about the sight of it, the CEO's ruined $3,000 suit, the rejected candidate's soaked gray shirt, the two of them walking side by side like old friends instead of a titan of industry and a man who had nearly given up, made more than one employee. In that lobby, stop what they were doing and simply watch. Nathaniel did not take Michael to a conference room, and he did not call Patricia Doyle back in to observe. Instead, he brought him up to his own office, offered him a towel and a cup of coffee, and sat down across from him, not behind the enormous mahogany desk but in the 2 chairs by the window, angled toward each other, the way 2 people sit when they intend to actually listen to one another. For the next hour, Michael told Nathaniel about Rachel, about the way she used to sing off-key on purpose just to make Grace laugh, about the 6 months of chemotherapy in the hospice bed in the living room and the particular quality of October light on the morning she died. He told him about the jobs he had lost and the jobs he had never gotten, about the pull-out couch and the landscaping work that left his hands cracked and bleeding in the winter, about the way Grace had started asking, gently, carefully, the way children do when they sense a fragile thing, whether they were going to be okay. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, without offering the kind of hollow sympathy that Michael had grown so tired of receiving from people who did not actually want to hear the answer, and when Michael finally finished, his voice hoarse, his coffee gone cold in his hands, Nathaniel told him his own story in return, about Diane, about the 18 months when the business nearly failed because he could not be in 2 places at once, about the particular guilt of a father who built an empire but missed his son's little league games, about a marriage that had survived the diagnosis but had never quite recovered from the years of strain, about a son, Jonathan, now grown, with whom Nathaniel was still, slowly, patiently, rebuilding a relationship that the hard years had worn thin. I'm telling you this, Nathaniel said, because I don't want you to think this is charity. I'm not offering you a job because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering you a job because a man who can hold a family together through what you've been through has exactly the kind of resilience I look for in the people who help me run this company. The gap in your resume isn't a weakness, Michael. It's the strongest evidence of character I've seen in a candidate in years. Patricia saw a risk. I see a man who doesn't quit, even when quitting would be so much easier. The position Nathaniel offered was not, in the end, the entry-level operations coordinator role Michael had originally applied for. It was something larger, a role on Hartwell's logistics planning team, with a salary nearly double what Michael had ever earned, full health benefits that would cover Grace, and, Nathaniel added almost as an afterthought, flexible hours, because he said he understood better than most executives that a father raising a daughter alone needed to be able to leave in the middle of the day for a school play or a fever or simply the ordinary, unglamorous work of being present. Michael sat in that chair, in his damp clothes, in the office of a man he had met less than 2 hours earlier, and felt something he had not let himself feel in 3 years, the terrifying, fragile sensation of a future opening back up in front of him. He did not accept immediately. Some old, wounded part of him needed to ask the question out loud, needed to hear it answered before he could let himself believe it. "Why me?" he asked. "There are 100 people in this city who could do this job and don't come with 3 years of gaps and a kid who needs picking up from school. Why chase me down the street in the rain?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the storm still moving over the city, and when he answered, his voice had the weight of a man setting down something he had carried a long time. "Because 22 years ago, nobody chased after me," he said. "I built this company on my own, out of stubbornness and fear and not knowing what else to do, and I told myself for years that the isolation was just the price of success. But it wasn't. It was just isolation. And somewhere along the way I decided that if I ever got the chance to be the person who ran towards someone instead of walking past them, I would take it, no matter how it looked, no matter whose meeting I was late for. Today, that chance had your name on it. That's why." Michael accepted the job 3 days later, after a weekend spent lying awake on the pull-out couch turning the offer over in his mind like a stone he was afraid might dissolve if he held it too tightly. After a long conversation with Grace at the kitchen counter in which he tried, imperfectly, to explain that things were about to get better, and watched his daughter's face do the complicated thing children's faces do when they have learned not to trust good news too quickly. "Are you sure, Daddy?" she had asked, and Michael had pulled her into his lap the way he had the morning her mother died, and told her that yes, this time, he was sure, though even as he said it he understood that the surest thing in the world was still only a promise, and promises, he had learned, required a person to keep showing up for them every single day. The first few months were not a fairy tale, and it would be dishonest to tell this story as though they were. Michael struggled, at first, in ways that had nothing to do with the actual work. The logistics planning itself came back to him quickly, muscle memory from his years in construction coordination translating more smoothly than he expected into the world of supply chains and freight schedules. What he struggled with was trust. 3 years of rejection had trained something deep and reflexive in him to expect the floor to drop out from under any good thing, and there were mornings he drove to Holbrook Tower half convinced that today would be the day someone in HR discovered a mistake had been made, that someone would call him into an office and tell him, politely, that this had all been some kind of error. He struggled, too, with the strange vertigo of stability after years of scarcity, the first time his direct deposit landed and he realized he did not have to choose between the electric bill and Grace's shoes. He sat in his car in the parking garage of Holbrook Tower for 10 minutes before he trusted himself to drive. Nathaniel, for his part, did not disappear back into the rarefied air of the executive floor once the job offer was signed, the way Michael had half expected he would. He checked in, not constantly, not in a way that felt like surveillance, but with a kind of steady, deliberate presence that Michael slowly came to understand was simply who Nathaniel was. He asked about Grace by name. He noticed, on the days Michael left early for a school event, and instead of frowning at it the way Michael's old employer used to, he would sometimes ask afterward how the spelling bee or the parent-teacher conference had gone, as though Michael's daughter's life mattered to him not as an HR accommodation but as an actual point of curiosity and care. 3 months into the job, Nathaniel invited Michael and Grace to a Hartwell Logistics family day at a park along the Cuyahoga River, and Michael watched, with an ache in his chest he did not have adequate words for, as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company knelt in the grass to help his daughter build a lopsided sandcastle near the picnic tables, patient and unhurried, The way a man builds something when he has finally learned not to take a single ordinary afternoon for granted. It was at that family day that Michael learned the rest of Nathaniel's story, the part he had not shared in the office that first rainy afternoon. Diane, Nathaniel's wife, was still alive. Her multiple sclerosis had stabilized years earlier with treatment, though it had left her using a wheelchair for anything more than short distances, and she came to the family day in a motorized chair, and Michael watched Nathaniel move through the crowd with an easy, practiced tenderness toward her, adjusting a blanket over her knees, bringing her a plate of food before serving himself, and Michael understood, watching them, that the wound Nathaniel carried was not a closed one, not a tidy redemption story tied up with a bow, but an ongoing, daily practice of showing up for the people he loved in whatever way that day required. Jonathan, the grown son, was there too, quieter than his father, still carrying some visible distance in the way he spoke to Nathaniel, though Michael noticed the two of them found their way, at one point in the afternoon, to a bench by the river, sitting close together, talking in low voices for nearly half an hour, and when they returned Jonathan's hand rested, briefly, on his father's shoulder in a way that looked like the first stone laid in a long overdue bridge. Grace, for her part, adored Nathaniel almost instantly, in the direct, uncomplicated way children love adults who kneel down to their level and ask real questions and actually wait for the answers. She began calling him Mr. Nate within the first 20 minutes of meeting him, and by the end of the family day she had appointed herself his official assistant sandcastle architect, issuing him detailed instructions about turret height with the seriousness of a construction foreman. Watching his daughter laugh like that, easily, freely, without the careful watchfulness that had crept into her over the last 3 hard years, Michael felt something in his chest loosen that he had not realized was still clenched tight. The real test of everything that had changed came 7 months into Michael's employment at Hartwell Logistics, in the middle of a February that brought one of the worst ice storms Cleveland had seen in a decade. Grace came home from school running a fever, and by that evening it had spiked to 104, and Michael, alone in the apartment with no family nearby and roads glazed with black ice, found himself in the exact position he had feared most since Rachel's death, a single father facing a crisis with nowhere to turn. He called Hartwell's emergency line out of habit more than expectation, intending only to leave a message explaining he would not be in the next day, and was startled when Nathaniel himself called back within 15 minutes, having apparently left a dinner event the moment he heard the message. Nathaniel did not simply tell him to take the day off. He asked, with a directness that cut through Michael's panic, whether Grace needed a doctor, whether Michael's car could safely make it to urgent care in the ice, and when Michael admitted, reluctantly, that his old truck's tires were bald and he did not trust them on the roads, Nathaniel told him to stay put. And 40 minutes later a car service Nathaniel had arranged himself pulled up outside the apartment to take Michael and Grace to the emergency room, with Nathaniel's own cell number texted to Michael in case he needed anything else that night. Grace had strep throat complicated by a mild case of pneumonia, serious enough to require 2 nights in the hospital, and Michael spent those nights in a vinyl recliner beside her bed, watching his daughter's chest rise and fall in the fluorescent hospital light, and could not stop the old fear from resurfacing, the fear that had lived in him since the oncologist's office 3 years earlier, the fear that the people he loved most were fragile in ways he could not control no matter how hard he tried. Somewhere around 2 in the morning on the second night, his phone buzzed with a text from Nathaniel, simply asking how she was doing, and Michael, exhausted and raw, texted back the truth, that he was terrified, that some nights the fear of losing someone else felt bigger than anything else in his life, bigger than money, bigger than jobs, bigger than everything. Nathaniel's response came a few minutes later, and Michael would keep that text saved on his phone for years afterward. Fear like that doesn't mean you're failing. It means you loved someone enough to be afraid of the world without them. I still feel it every single day about Diane, and it has never once meant I was weak. It means you're exactly the kind of father Grace needs. I'm glad you're not carrying this alone tonight. Call if you need anything, any hour. Grace recovered fully within 2 weeks, bouncing back with the resilient speed that children somehow manage even after they have frightened their parents half to death, and when Michael returned to work, feeling as though he owed the company an apology for the days missed, Nathaniel waved off the very idea before Michael could finish the sentence. You were where you needed to be, he said simply. That's not something you apologize for here. That's the entire point of building a place worth working for. Over the following 2 years, Michael's life did not transform into something unrecognizable so much as it slowly, steadily became something whole again, brick by brick, the way a house is rebuilt after a fire, not identical to what stood before, but sturdy, and lived in, and finally safe. He was promoted twice, eventually taking over as regional logistics director for Hartwell's Ohio operations, a role that came with a salary that let him move himself and Grace out of the one-bedroom apartment and into a small house with a real backyard in a neighborhood with a school district Grace loved, the kind of house Michael used to drive past on weekends with Rachel, years earlier, both of them saying someday without either of them quite believing it. He kept Rachel's photograph on the mantel, and some evenings, after Grace had gone to bed, he would sit in the quiet living room and talk to it, telling her about the promotion, about Grace's grades, about the strange, undeserved kindness of a man who had chased him down a rainy street instead of letting him disappear, and though Rachel never answered, of course, Michael found that the telling itself had become a kind of peace he had not expected to find again. He and Nathaniel became, over those 2 years, something that neither of them had quite planned on, and neither of them would have predicted that first rainy afternoon, not merely employer and employee, but something closer to family, in the way that people sometimes become family not through blood but through the accumulated weight of showing up for each other again and again when it mattered. Nathaniel attended Grace's 4th grade graduation ceremony, sitting beside Michael in a folding chair in a school gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and construction paper, clapping so hard for a child who was not his own grandchild that the woman next to him asked, with genuine curiosity, how he was related to the little girl in the blue dress walking across the stage. Family, Nathaniel had answered simply, and Michael, sitting beside him, had needed a long moment before he trusted his voice enough to agree. Diane, too, became a steady presence in Michael and Grace's life, inviting them for Sunday dinners at the Coles' home on the outskirts of the city, teaching Grace to bake bread with the kind of patient, unhurried instruction that Grace had not had the chance to receive from a grandmother figure since Rachel's own mother had passed years earlier. On one of those Sunday evenings, nearly 2 years after the rainy afternoon outside Holbrook Tower, Diane pulled Michael aside in the kitchen while Grace and Nathaniel argued good-naturedly in the other room about the proper way to build a blanket fort, and told him something that Michael carried with him for a long time afterward. "You gave him something back," she said, "that I don't think even I could give him. For 20 years he built and built and built, trying to prove that the years he lost when I was sick hadn't broken anything, and I don't think he ever believed it, not really, until the day he ran out into that storm after you. I think some part of him needed to know he was still capable of running towards someone instead of away from his own pain. You gave him that back. I hope you know that." Michael, of course, had never thought of it that way, had always assumed himself to be the only one who had been rescued that rainy afternoon, and Diane's words settled into him slowly over the following weeks, reshaping the story in his mind from a simple tale of charity into something more complicated and more true. 2 broken men, each carrying grief the other understood in his bones, each finding in the other's survival a permission to believe that his own losses had not been the end of the story after all. Jonathan, Nathaniel's son, eventually came to work at Hartwell Logistics as well, taking a role in the company's community outreach division, and it was Jonathan who, 3 years after that first rainy day, proposed the idea that would become the Second Chance Initiative, a formal hiring program at Hartwell Logistics specifically designed to identify and support candidates whose resumes carried the kinds of gaps that had once cost Michael his interview: caregivers, widowed parents, people rebuilding their lives after illness or loss or hardship that no standardized form had a box for. Nathaniel approved the program without hesitation, and asked Michael, by then regional director, to help design its framework, because who better, he said, to build something like this than the man who had once nearly walked away from Hartwell Logistics forever over a single rejected line on a piece of paper. Patricia Doyle, to her credit, became one of the program's most dedicated advocates once it launched, having spent 3 years quietly carrying the memory of the interview that had almost cost the company its best hire, and she would later tell new hiring managers, in every training session she ran, The story of the day: she nearly let a good man walk out the door because his resume told a story she had not taken the time to actually read. The Second Chance Initiative held its first annual recognition dinner in the fall, in the very same marble lobby of Holbrook Tower where Michael had once walked out through the revolving doors into a rainstorm with nothing left to lose, and it was there, 3 years almost to the day after that first rainy afternoon, that Nathaniel Cole stood at a podium in front of 200 employees, dozens of the initiative's new hires, and their families, to tell the story that had started it all. He told them about a man named Michael Sawyer, about a rain-soaked sidewalk on 9th and Superior, about a decision he had made in less time than it takes to read a single sentence, to run instead of walk, to chase instead of let go. He did not tell it as a story about his own generosity. He was careful, deliberate, in making sure the room understood that the story belonged to Michael's courage as much as to his own choice to run. But he told it, he said, because he wanted every person in that room, every new hire nervous about their own complicated history, to understand something he wished someone had told him 22 years earlier, that the hardest chapters of a person's life are so often mistaken for weaknesses, when in truth they are simply proof of a strength that has not yet been given the chance to be seen. Michael sat in the front row that evening with Grace beside him, now 11 years old, in a dress she had picked out herself for the occasion, and when Nathaniel finished speaking and the room rose in applause, Michael felt his daughter's small hand slip into his, and he thought, not for the first time, of the morning 3 years earlier when he had stood beneath a gray Cleveland sky with nothing but a soaked resume and the quiet, terrible certainty that he had failed, and he thought of how impossible it would have seemed to that man, standing in the rain, that he would one day be sitting in this same building being thanked by name for helping to build something that might change other families' lives the way his own had been changed. He thought of Rachel, and hoped, in the way a person hopes about things they cannot know for certain, that she could somehow see this room, see their daughter's steady hand in his, see the life he had managed, against every fear he had carried since the morning she died, to rebuild. If Michael's story has moved something in you tonight, if it's reminded you that a single act of kindness can change the entire direction of someone's life, please don't scroll past without leaving your mark. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story that might just restore your faith in people. And before we close this chapter, I want to ask you something directly, in the comments below. Tell us about a moment when a stranger's kindness changed the course of your life, or a moment when you chose to be that kindness for someone else. I read every single one, and I promise you, your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Grace Sawyer is 14 years old now, in her first year of high school, and she still keeps a small framed photograph on her nightstand of a rainy sidewalk on 9th and Superior Street, not an actual photograph from that day, since no one thought to take one in the chaos of the moment, but a pencil sketch she drew herself for a school art project 2 years ago, when her teacher asked the class to illustrate a moment that changed everything, and Grace, without hesitation, drew 2 men standing in the rain, one reaching toward the other, because her father had told her the story so many times by then that she could see it in her mind as clearly as if she had been standing on that corner herself. Michael still works at Hartwell Logistics, now as Vice President of Operations, and he still, every single year on the anniversary of that rainy October afternoon, drives to Holbrook Tower after work, stands beneath the same glass awning where he once stood soaked and broken, and simply breathes for a moment, remembering, before he drives home to make dinner with his daughter in a kitchen that belongs to them, in a house that belongs to them, in a life that very nearly did not happen at all. Nathaniel Cole is 60 years old now, still running Hartwell Logistics, though he has begun, slowly, to hand more of the company's daily operations to Jonathan, choosing instead to spend more of his time on the Second Chance Initiative, which has since grown from a single division at one company into a program that has been adopted, in some form, by more than 30 businesses across Ohio, helping hundreds of caregivers, widowed parents, and people rebuilding shattered lives find their way back into the workforce with dignity instead of suspicion. He still tells the story of the rainy afternoon whenever a new employee joins the program, and he still, every time he tells it, gets to the same line, the one he has never managed to say without his voice catching just slightly, that the most important decision he ever made in 25 years of building a company was not a merger or an acquisition or a quarterly earnings call, but the choice, on one ordinary rainy Tuesday, to run instead of walk. Some people, when they hear this story, want to know what would have happened if Nathaniel had simply gone back to his afternoon meetings that day, if he had let the elevator doors close on Michael Sawyer the way they had closed on so many other candidates whose gaps and struggles did not fit neatly onto a resume. Michael has thought about that question more than anyone in the quiet hours of nights when sleep does not come easily, and the honest answer, he has come to believe, is that he does not know exactly what would have happened, only that it would have been smaller, harder, lonelier, another chapter in a story about a man who kept surviving without ever quite getting to live. What he knows for certain, what he tells Grace whenever she asks him to tell the story again, which she still does, even now, even though she has heard it 100 times, is that the world is somehow, impossibly, still full of people willing to run through the rain for a stranger, and that the only thing separating an ordinary Tuesday from the day that changes everything is often nothing more than one person deciding, in the space of a single sentence, not to let someone else disappear. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it touched your heart even a little, if it made you believe, even for a moment, that kindness still has the power to change everything, please take 10 seconds right now to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, because we have so many more stories like this one still to tell, and every single one of them is better with you here to watch it unfold. Thank you for believing in second chances. We'll see you in the next story.